Welcome to another deep dive. We're going deep on authentic culture, which sounds simple enough.
Right.
But, wow, when you actually start looking into it, it gets really complex fast.
It does.
And luckily, you sent in a really interesting mix of sources on this, so I'm really excited to kind of dig through this. And I think there are a few things that we can try to cover today. Like, first of all, what does authentic culture even mean? How is it different from just like popular culture, things that are trendy, or how is it different from tourist traps?
Yeah.
And also, how can we be sure that we're being respectful when we encounter another culture? And how can we really appreciate it without appropriating it? That's a big one. And then we can even get into like how the world is trying to protect all these amazing cultural traditions and how globalization is changing things. And also, why is it so important to understand history when we're talking about authentic culture? I mean, your sources were really diverse. Like we've got stuff here from anthropologists, sociologists, literature, indigenous studies, even stuff about the workplace.
Yeah.
So it should be an interesting deep dive.
It's going to be fascinating because when you first encounter this term, authentic culture, you might have this image that pops into your head of something ancient, preserved and untouched.
Right, right.
But what's really interesting is how quickly that picture starts to change and become so much more, nuanced when we actually start looking at what these sources say. Because what they really emphasize is that this idea of authenticity, it isn't about something that's just frozen in the past.
Right. So let's jump into the anthropology stuff first. It seems like, at least early on, anthropologists were obsessed with finding these quote-unquote pure cultures.
Yeah.
The ones that were like untouched by the West, like they were frozen in time or something. Why was that such a big deal back then?
Well, you're right. Early anthropologists, especially when they started doing more field work, they were very focused on documenting societies that seemed isolated from Western influence. And this led to this idea of the ethnographic present, which basically, you're right, it presented these cultures as like unchanging, frozen in a specific moment. And the thought was that if a culture had less contact with the outside world, it was somehow more authentic.
Oh, okay.
Which, looking back, it was well-intentioned in a way. They wanted to record these diverse ways of life.
Right.
But the problem was they were assuming these cultures were like static and pure, and they ignored the fact that cultures have always been exchanging ideas and influencing each other throughout history.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a very limited perspective, like stuck in its own time.
Yeah.
And I mean, can any culture really exist in total isolation? It seems impossible. So how has that view changed over time?
Well, thankfully, modern anthropology has pretty much rejected that idea of a pristine, untouched culture.
Yeah.
What they focus on now is that authenticity is, a social construct.
Yeah.
So what we see as real or authentic isn't like some fixed thing. It's more about what we as a society or a group agree on. And of course, that's constantly changing.
Right. So it's not like an objective fact about a culture. It's more about how people within that culture see themselves.
Right, exactly. And that perception of what's authentic depends on the context. So what feels authentic to someone who lives in a particular culture might be totally different from what a tourist sees as authentic, or even how an anthropologist might analyze it. It's fascinating, because even within a single cultural group, you can have totally different, even conflicting ideas about what's authentic. And this is where the term polysemic comes in. Basically, it means that authenticity has all these different layers of meaning, like genuineness, originality, accuracy, truthfulness. They're all kind of tangled up together.
Okay, so when someone says this is authentic, they might mean different things depending on what they're talking about. It could be about how old it is or whether it's original or if it feels genuine. And those aren't always the same thing, right?
Right, and that's what makes it so interesting. It's so much more fluid and dynamic than you might think.
Yeah, absolutely. So how does sociology fit into this? How do sociologists view authentic culture?
Well, sociologists tend to connect authenticity with identity, both on a personal level and within society as a whole. It's about that feeling of being true to your own beliefs and values, even when there's pressure to conform. But they also look at how we navigate social norms and expectations to maintain that sense of a genuine self, because there are always outside pressures and influences.
Right. So it's not just about how you feel inside. It's about how you express that authentic self in the real world.
Exactly. And sociology also pays a lot of attention to folk culture, which is basically the culture that comes from the everyday lives of ordinary people. So think of things like traditional music, storytelling that's passed down through families, folk dances, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And the sources point out that this folk culture isn't just something you inherit passively. It's something that communities actively create and recreate. It's often tied to the physical environment, to the landscape.
Right, right.
So it's very tangible. It's grounded in real experiences and local traditions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's less abstract than some of these broader definitions.
Absolutely. And when we talk about subcultures, sociology again emphasizes that authenticity is a social construct. So within a subculture, showing how authentic you are, like knowing the right bands, having the right style, or following certain beliefs, it's not just about personal taste. It becomes a form of, subcultural capital.
Oh,
It's a way to show that you belong, that you're one of them, and that you're different from outsiders.
right, right. It's like you said, a form of currency almost.
Yeah, and people in subcultures, they often perform their authenticity, through their behavior, the symbols they use, their style. All of that reinforces their identity and shows that they're part of the group.
It's like a visual language almost. It's like,
Right.
hey, I'm one of you. Now, moving beyond anthropology and sociology, how do other areas like literature or indigenous studies view this whole idea of cultural authenticity?
That's where things get even more specific and culturally sensitive, you could say. In international literature, for example, they often talk about cultural authenticity in terms of how accurately a story reflects a particular culture's worldview,
Yeah.
their beliefs, their values, daily life, their language.
Right, so it's about portraying a culture in a way that feels true and real.
Yeah, exactly. And for indigenous cultures, authenticity has these really deep connections to their history, their sovereignty, and their right to self-determination. It's often about making sure something has a genuine and truthful origin, that the process of making it is true to tradition, that the community is involved, and that the creator or the company is genuinely indigenous.
So like a handcrafted item, its authenticity comes from who made it, the traditional techniques they used, and how connected it is to the community and their heritage.
Precisely. They place a huge emphasis on that connection to the community and the history of the craft or tradition.
Yeah, it's not just about the object itself, it's about the whole story behind it. Now, it's interesting to see how this idea of authenticity has even popped up in the business world, particularly in discussions of company culture.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like, how can we create workplaces where people feel comfortable being themselves and where the environment is genuine and supportive? It's a different way of using the term, but it's still about that core idea of being true to yourself and your values, right?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so authentic culture has all these different meanings depending on who's talking about it and what context they're talking about it in. But how does it stand out from other concepts like popular culture and tourist culture? Where do the lines get blurry and where are they totally distinct?
That's a great question. And it's really important to understand those differences. When we talk about popular culture, we're talking about mainstream trends, what's popular in music, fashion, entertainment. These are things that are heavily influenced by the media and consumerism.
Yeah, like global hits, fashion trends you see everywhere, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it usually has a clear origin, like a specific artist or company, and it spreads really fast thanks to technology.
Right, right.
Folk culture, on the other hand, often has roots that are hard to trace. It comes from communities and it spreads more slowly, mostly through face-to-face interactions and people physically moving around.
So popular culture is more like a top-down phenomenon. It comes from media centers and spreads outward, whereas folk culture is more like a grassroots movement, coming up organically from the ground up.
That's a great way to put it. And some of the sources express concern about globalized popular culture kind of overshadowing and even eroding local folk culture and authentic cultural expressions. There's this fear of what they call cultural homogenization, like dominant cultural norms, often from the West, start to replace unique traditions and values.
Right.
And some critics even argue that capitalist popular culture isn't really of the people at all.
Oh, okay.
It's more like a system that creates artificial desires and products.
Yeah, I can see that. It makes sense that a big chain restaurant might feel less authentic to a community that has its own special culinary traditions.
Exactly. But, it's not like folk culture is just sitting there passively. It can be a way for communities to resist those dominant forces and hold on to their own identities. And the internet has been a huge game changer. It's created a space for what they call cultural hybridization,
Oh, okay.
where elements of folk culture and popular culture can mix and create something entirely new.
Oh, interesting. So it's not a simple takeover. It's more of a dynamic interaction where things are constantly changing and adapting.
Right.
Now, what about tourist culture? This seems particularly tricky because tourism often tries to sell these authentic experiences.
Yeah, you've hit a nerve there.
Yeah.
The tourism industry definitely makes a lot of money by promising those authentic encounters.
Hmm.
But what the sources highlight is that authenticity in tourism is really complicated. Like, there's the objective side. Is this historical site really what they say it is? But then there's the subjective side. How do tourists experience it? Are they bringing their own preconceived notions and stereotypes?
Right.
And then there's this almost existential level. Did they feel a genuine connection with the place and its people?
Oh, wow. So where does stage authenticity fit into all of this? Where aspects of a culture are created or modified for tourists.
Exactly. You might see like a recreated traditional village, but it has all the modern comforts.
Right.
Or a cultural performance that's been shortened or changed to fit into a tourist schedule.
Okay.
And while this can make cultural heritage more accessible to more people, there are valid concerns about commodification, basically turning cultural values and practices into products to be bought and sold.
Right. Like losing that original meaning and depth.
Exactly. And sometimes tourists, they just want that picture-perfect, authentic experience, even if it's not really genuine.
Yeah, as long as it fits their idea of what it should be.
Exactly. So it's a delicate balance between sharing culture and protecting it from being exploited for profit. How can communities benefit from tourism without losing their cultural values?
Right. It's a tough question. So how do they do it? How do destinations and communities find that balance?
Well, the sources really stress the importance of getting local communities involved in tourism planning and development from the very beginning.
Okay.
They need to have a say in how their culture is presented. It's also about promoting responsible tourism practices that minimize negative impacts and making sure that the money from tourism actually benefits the local people. Ideally, tourism should create genuine connections and understanding, not just superficial encounters.
Mhm.
And it's important to remember that tourists often come with their own ideas of what's authentic, and those ideas might not match up with how the local community sees their own culture.
Right. So that leads us to this important question. How can individuals and communities show genuine respect for other cultures? What are some practical things we can do?
It starts with education and awareness. We need to actively seek out information about other cultures, read books and articles, watch documentaries, listen to music, talk to people from different backgrounds.
Right. Just immerse yourself as much as possible.
Exactly. And then it's about respectful communication and behavior. Like learning basic greetings in the local language, being mindful of different customs around eye contact and personal space, understanding the concept of time might be different in other cultures.
Right. So many little things to be aware of.
Yeah. And when you're actually in a different cultural environment, it's about mindful participation. Taking off your shoes before entering a home or a sacred space, dressing respectfully, understanding eating etiquette,
Right.
like how to use chopsticks or which hand to use when eating, being aware of tipping customs, knowing how to bargain respectfully in markets,
Oh.
and always asking permission before taking photos, especially of people.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
And of course, avoiding stereotypes and prejudgments is essential.
Absolutely. We need to remember that every culture is diverse, and we should treat each person as an individual. And we need to be aware of our own biases and understand that our own culture isn't inherently better than others.
Mm-hmm. So much to think about. Now, how can we foster that respect on a larger scale within communities or organizations?
Well, the sources talk about how important it is to involve community members in planning cultural events and preservation efforts,
Okay.
making sure that their voices are heard and their traditions are represented authentically. And we can support local artisans and businesses, especially indigenous creators, by buying authentic handicrafts and learning about where things come from, their cultural significance, and the correct terms to use.
Right.
We should also be careful not to buy things that are considered sacred or that perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And creating spaces for genuine cultural exchange, like festivals, workshops, educational programs, can help build understanding and appreciation.
Yeah, absolutely. And education plays a huge role in all of this, right?
It does. We need to teach about different cultures in schools at all levels, expose kids to diverse perspectives from a young age, learning about different religions, visiting places of worship with respect, engaging with different art forms. All of that can broaden understanding and cultivate empathy.
Yeah, definitely.
And public awareness campaigns can also be really effective in educating people about cultural diversity and the harm of appropriation.
That brings us to a really important topic. The difference between cultural appropriation and genuine cultural appreciation. can be tricky to know where the line is. How can we be sure we're on the right side of that line?
The key difference is about power dynamics, understanding, and respect. Cultural appropriation happens when a dominant culture takes elements from a marginalized culture without permission, understanding, or respect. They might take those elements out of context, trivialize them, or even profit from them without giving back to the community.
Right, and we see this all the time, like people wearing Native American headdresses as fashion or using religious symbols from other cultures in a disrespectful way.
Exactly. Or when non-Black people adopt Black hairstyles without acknowledging their history and significance. And it happens in other ways, too, like creating costumes that perpetuate stereotypes, or companies profiting from traditional art forms without permission. And the consequences of appropriation can be really harmful. It can erase the contributions of the original creators, reinforce stereotypes, offend and hurt people, strip cultural elements of their meaning, and ultimately perpetuate inequalities.
So what does cultural appreciation look like? How can we engage with other cultures in a way that's respectful and meaningful?
Cultural appreciation is all about genuine understanding, respect, and admiration. It's about learning the history and cultural significance of something, engaging with it in a respectful and informed way, and whenever possible, it involves getting consent and collaborating with people from that culture.
So it's about learning and honoring, not just imitating or taking.
Exactly. It's about seeking consent, collaborating, giving credit, honoring rather than just imitating. Like buying artwork directly from an artist from that culture, sharing your own culture in a respectful way, or learning a craft from a skilled practitioner. It's about broadening your perspective, not just trying to get attention or make money without regard for the culture's meaning.
Right.
And it's about always asking yourself, do I really understand this? Am I honoring it, or am I just following a trend? Am I maybe perpetuating stereotypes without realizing it?
Right. It's about checking yourself and making sure you're not doing harm.
Yeah, because true appreciation empowers marginalized communities. It doesn't take away from them.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about what's being done on a global scale
Yeah.
to protect and promote these authentic cultural expressions. What are some of the big initiatives out there?
Well, there are a lot of efforts happening, thankfully, at all levels. International organizations, especially UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they do a lot to identify, protect, and preserve cultural and natural heritage that has outstanding value to humanity. They have something called the World Heritage Convention, which sets a framework for this work. And they also have programs dedicated to safeguarding what they call intangible cultural heritage, which are those traditions, practices, knowledge, and skills that are passed down through generations. UNESCO gives its member states resources and guidance to help them with their preservation efforts.
What about on a national or local level? What kinds of things are happening there?
Well, a lot of governments have policies and funding for protecting and restoring cultural heritage sites and objects. They also have laws to stop people from illegally trading cultural artifacts. And they support education initiatives to teach people about their cultural heritage. Museums, libraries, and archives are also super important for documenting and preserving this heritage.
Right.
And there are organizations like the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative that work to protect cultural heritage that's threatened by war, natural disasters, or other crises.
Okay, wow.
There are also many grassroots efforts focused on preserving endangered languages, supporting traditional arts and crafts, and documenting indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, and it's really the local communities who are the most dedicated protectors of their own heritage, right?
They are. They organize festivals, establish cultural centers, and work hard to keep traditions alive. Some great examples are Georgetown in Malaysia, where they're trying to balance development with heritage conservation, and Aula in Saudi Arabia, which is using its local heritage to promote sustainable tourism.
Yeah, that's awesome. And some of the community-led projects are so inspiring, like Finland's Adopt a Monument program or Greece's digital storytelling initiative. It really shows that people all over the world are recognizing the importance of preserving their cultural heritage.
It does. It's like a growing global consciousness about the value of our diverse cultural heritage.
Now, we can't talk about culture today without talking about globalization. How is globalization shaping authentic culture, both in good ways and bad?
Yeah, globalization is a mixed bag. On the one hand, there's concern about cultural homogenization. This is where dominant cultural forms, often from the West, spread and potentially push out more localized and traditional cultures.
Right, like everyone eating the same fast food, wearing the same clothes, listening to the same music.
Exactly. It can lead to a feeling that everywhere is starting to look and feel the same, and that unique cultural identities are being lost.
Right, and the economic and political power behind those dominant cultures just makes it harder to resist.
It does. But on the flip side, globalization can also lead to cultural hybridization,
Oh, well, right.
which is where different cultures mix and create new, unique forms. With more people traveling, ideas spreading, and technology connecting us, there's this fusion of cultural elements that's happening all the time. So maybe globalization isn't just about losing diversity, but also about adaptation and change.
That's a good point. And mass media and technology are obviously huge factors in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. Things like television, film, music, the internet, and social media have sped up the spread of global culture and impacted local traditions in a big way.
Hmm.
It's great that we have access to so many different cultures now, but there's also the risk that globalized media will drown out local content, and it's easier than ever for cultural elements to be taken out of context and appropriated.
Right, right. So in this globalized world, how are communities holding on to their unique identities?
The sources highlight a lot of different efforts. Communities are focusing on cultural education, organizing festivals, even trying to get legal protection for their cultural heritage. They're realizing that they need to preserve their culture while also being part of the globalized world. It's about finding a balance between tradition and modernity, between local and global.
Right, so it's not about rejecting globalization entirely. It's about engaging with it in a way that doesn't erase your own cultural identity.
Exactly. It's about promoting heritage through education, tourism, government support. It's about welcoming people from other cultures while also protecting your own. It's tricky, but it's essential.
Yeah, it's a constant negotiation. Which reminds us that this idea of an unchanging, authentic culture is kind of a myth, right? Cultures are always evolving. And that's where the importance of historical context comes in. Why is understanding history so important for understanding cultural authenticity?
Because cultures aren't frozen in time. They're always changing, adapting, taking in new influences. As one of the sources said, cultures create their own realities.
Okay.
And when different cultures meet, those realities interact, and often power dynamics come into play. Basically, all cultures are constantly making themselves up. They create new traditions, borrow from others, and reinterpret their own history. So to say that tourism or any kind of exchange automatically destroys authenticity is too simplistic. We need to look at history to understand when something is truly harmful to a culture and when it's just a part of natural cultural change. We can't romanticize the past or assume that there was some pure, untouched version of a culture before contact with others.
So what we see as authentic today is the result of a long history of interactions and transformations.
Exactly. And when we're talking about preserving historical sites and artifacts, authenticity is more than just the physical state of the object.
Right.
It's also about its historical associations, its cultural value, its meaning to the community. Like the World Heritage Convention says that authenticity is about truthfully representing cultural values. And the NARA document on authenticity says that we should judge authenticity within the cultural context, not based on some universal standard.
So even when we're trying to preserve the past, we have to be mindful how we're interpreting it.
Exactly. We can't ignore how historical events have shaped cultures. And when we're restoring something, we need to find a way to preserve it without erasing the marks of time or pretending it's something it's not.
Right, right. So in the end, understanding authenticity means recognizing the constant interplay between tradition and change. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. What are some of the key ethical considerations we should keep in mind when interacting with different cultures?
Well, first and foremost, we need to approach those interactions with respect, empathy, and a genuine desire to understand. We need to recognize the inherent value of all cultures, their ethical systems, their values, their practices, and we need to try to see the world from their perspective. Open communication, mutual respect, and a sincere effort to understand differences are essential.
And of course, avoiding stereotypes and misrepresentation is crucial.
Absolutely. We have to challenge our own biases, see the diversity within each culture, and treat everyone as an individual. And if we're going to represent another culture, we need to be accurate and respectful. Misrepresenting a culture, even unintentionally, can cause harm and reinforce negative stereotypes. If you work in a field where you interact with people from other cultures, you need to be especially aware of your own biases and work to overcome them.
Yeah, that's so important.
Yeah.
And consent and collaboration seem to be key ethical considerations, especially when dealing with cultural heritage.
They are. It's crucial to get free, prior informed consent from communities before you engage with their heritage.
Okay.
This means being transparent, having open dialogues, being willing to negotiate, and consulting with the community. They have the right to decide what they consider harmful to their culture and how to protect it. And we need to respect their customs, even if they limit public access to certain things.
Right. It's about letting them lead the way.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about power dynamics, can we?
No, we can't. We need to be aware of the power imbalances that often exist between cultures and work towards equity, not exploitation. As we talked about earlier, cultural appropriation often happens because of those power imbalances. We need to promote diversity in leadership and make sure that everyone's voice is heard. And most importantly, we need to keep learning, keep adapting, and keep reflecting on our own practices.
Wow, this has been a really insightful deep dive. We started with what seemed like a simple concept, but it's turned out to be so much more complex and nuanced. The big takeaway for me is that authentic culture isn't some fixed definition.
Right.
It's constantly evolving, and it's shaped by history, by social interactions, and by how people interpret their own culture. We need to move beyond those simple ideas of what's real and appreciate the dynamic nature of culture.
I agree. I hope this conversation has given you, the listener, some food for thought about how you understand authenticity and how you interact with other cultures.
So here's something to think about. How can we all help build a global culture where everyone's culture is respected and celebrated? How can we move beyond superficial encounters and create deeper understanding and meaningful connections? We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and dig deeper into the sources we've discussed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.